Before we talk about personality, let's start with an image. Imagine growing up under permanent overcast skies. Not a storm, not chaos, just a steady grayness. Nothing dramatic enough to point to, nothing obviously wrong. And yet, over time, the body adapts. You learn to dress differently. You stop expecting warmth. You adjust your rhythm to the light that's available. Parenting works like that more often than we admit. Not as a series of events, but as a climate, a tone, a nervous system atmosphere that the child breathes every day without language for it. And the adaptation that forms inside that climate often looks, years later, like personality. This is where many men quietly misinterpret themselves. They say, "I've just always been introverted. I've always been calm. I don't need much. I'm low maintenance." Sometimes that's true. Temperament is real. But sometimes what looks like introversion is not a preference for solitude. It's a protective posture learned early, when expression felt risky and silence felt safer. Not consciously, not as a decision, but as an adjustment made by a nervous system that was paying very close attention. Children don't have the luxury of analyzing their environment. They adapt to it. If a home is emotionally unpredictable, the child doesn't think, "This is unsafe." The body simply learns, stay small, stay quiet, don't add weight to the room. And here's where culture reinforces the adaptation. We praise quiet children. We call them mature, easy, old souls. We reward them for not needing much, for not causing friction, for being agreeable. That praise feels good. It lands as warmth, approval, belonging. And slowly, subtly, identity begins to wire itself around it. This is who I am. This is why I'm loved. Over time, the child learns not how to speak, but how to scan. He becomes a radar, not a speaker. He tracks moods. He senses shifts in tone. He notices when it's better to hold something back, when a need might be inconvenient, when a feeling might tip the balance of the room. Expression becomes secondary. Awareness becomes survival. From the outside, this looks like emotional intelligence. From the inside, it often feels like vigilance. And this is the quiet paradox. What appears as calm adulthood can sometimes be lifelong self-erasure, refined into something socially acceptable. The man who never asks for much. The man who listens more than he speaks. The man who feels responsible for the emotional weather in every room. There is nothing inherently wrong with quiet. Nothing wrong with reflection, solitude, or depth. The question is not whether you are introverted. The question is whether your quiet is a choice or an inheritance. Carl Jung spoke about the persona as the face we present to the world, shaped by what our environment rewards. When a child is rewarded for silence, composure, and compliance, that persona hardens early. It becomes reliable, admirable, and eventually invisible to the one wearing it. The shadow, in Jungian terms, is not something dark or bad. It's simply what had no place to go. Unexpressed needs, unspoken anger, unlived spontaneity. Not because the child was flawed, but because the environment couldn't receive those parts. From a nervous system perspective, this makes sense. When emotional expression doesn't feel safe or welcome, the system doesn't fight. It doesn't protest. It settles into withdrawal, a low-grade freeze, a quiet economy of energy that says, less is safer. And the tragedy is that this adaptation often works. It produces capable men, thoughtful men, men who don't make waves, men who can endure a great deal without complaint, until one day, endurance starts to feel like disappearance. If you've ever felt that your calm comes at the cost of aliveness, that your peace feels thin, or that your needs arrive only when they're already urgent, this conversation is not here to pathologize you. It's here to offer clarity. Because what you learned early was not weakness, it was intelligence applied under constraint. And midway through this video, we'll name the parenting pattern most men defend without realizing how deeply it shaped their isolation. Not to assign blame, but to loosen the grip of something that no longer needs to run your life. For now, just notice your breath as you listen, the way your body responds to these words. Not to judge, just to register. Quiet is not the problem. Silence that was never chosen is, and understanding the difference is where everything begins. There is a particular kind of home that leaves no obvious scars, no shouting that outsiders can point to, no single incident dramatic enough to name, just emotional unpredictability, subtle, shifting, difficult to read. In that kind of environment, the child learns early that presence itself can be disruptive. Not because he is told so directly, but because the emotional ground beneath him never feels stable. A parent's mood changes without warning. Warmth appears and disappears. Needs are sometimes met, sometimes ignored, sometimes subtly resented. The child doesn't think in words. His body thinks for him, and the body learns something very specific. The safest version of me is the least noticeable one. So he learns to minimize. He lowers his volume. He delays his needs. He waits for the room to settle before taking up space, not out of fear in the dramatic sense, but out of calibration, a finely tuned adjustment to emotional weather that cannot be controlled. From a nervous system lens, this makes sense. When stress is chronic but low-grade, when there is no clear fight or flight option, the system often chooses freeze or withdrawal, not collapse, but containment, a holding pattern. This is not weakness. It is regulation under constraint. The child's system discovers that expression brings friction, while silence preserves connection. And connection, for a dependent nervous system, is survival. So silence becomes strategic. This is where introversion is often misunderstood. What develops here is not shyness, not social anxiety, not even preference for solitude. It is strategic invisibility, a learned capacity to disappear just enough to stay safe. Years later, this man may describe himself as calm, grounded, unbothered. Others may admire his steadiness, his ability to handle pressure, his emotional control, and none of that is false. But underneath, there is often a deeper realization waiting to surface. I became calm because strong emotion had nowhere to land. Many men encounter this realization unexpectedly, not in therapy at first, but in reflection, late at night, reading a story that feels too familiar. One man, writing anonymously online, described growing up in a house where emotions were either ignored or quietly punished, not yelled at, just met with withdrawal, dismissal, or subtle disapproval. He learned to be agreeable, self-contained, low impact. As an adult, he was praised for being easygoing. Partners described him as stable. Employers trusted him. And yet he wrote with a kind of stunned clarity, "I thought this was my personality. I'm realizing now it was my strategy." That sentence carries weight because it names something without accusation. The silence didn't disappear. It matured. It became politeness. It became professionalism. It became emotional self-sufficiency. Socially acceptable forms of disappearance. Jung might say that the child's adaptation became a persona so effective it erased the need to look behind it. The shadow, meanwhile, filled with unfelt frustration, muted desire, and needs that learned to arrive only when they could no longer be ignored. From the outside, nothing looks wrong. From the inside, something feels oddly distant, a sense of being present everywhere except in oneself. If any part of this resonates, there is no requirement to fix it, confront it, or push against it. Awareness alone begins to soften patterns that were once rigid. And 2 chapters from now, we'll place this silence inside a wider cultural frame, comparing how different parenting ideals arrive at the same outcome through different routes. For now, simply notice the quality of quiet you recognize in yourself. Does it feel spacious or restrained? Because silence born from choice feels different in the body than silence born from adaptation. And learning to tell the difference is the first step toward reclaiming something that was never lost, only postponed. There is another path into quietness that looks on the surface like success. Not the child who learned to disappear because the home felt volatile, but the child who learned to shine by staying agreeable. The one who received praise not for who he was, but for how little friction he created. This child learns early that approval has conditions. He is rewarded for being reasonable, helpful, mature beyond his years. He senses, often without words, that his parents are anxious about stability, about appearances, about control. And without malice, that anxiety gets handed down. Don't make things harder. Be good. Why can't you be like this all the time? The message is subtle but consistent. Harmony matters more than authenticity. From the inside, the child adapts by aligning himself with what brings approval. He becomes skilled at reading expectations and meeting them. Compliance begins to feel like safety. Praise becomes a signal that he is secure. This is where identity starts to narrow. Psychologically, this is conditional attunement. The child is seen and valued, but only when certain parts of him are active. Other parts, anger, defiance, neediness, spontaneity, receive less warmth, less attention, or gentle correction. Over time, the nervous system learns to associate approval with a small spike of dopamine. Being good feels good. Being autonomous feels risky. Autonomy begins to carry a quiet threat. What if I lose connection? So the child chooses what every dependent nervous system chooses: connection over self-expression. Later, this pattern often shows up as perfectionism, not the loud, driven kind, but the quiet, internal one. The man who holds himself to invisible standards, who feels uneasy resting, who experiences a subtle tension when he doesn't know what's expected of him. Philosophically, this pattern was warned about long before psychology gave it language. Nietzsche spoke about morality not always as virtue, but sometimes as domestication, a shaping of the self to fit what the environment rewards, at the cost of instinct and vitality. Not because morality is bad, but because when it is imposed without dialogue, it can shrink the soul. This dynamic crosses cultures. In some East Asian contexts, the good child is obedient, high-achieving, self-sacrificing. In many Western contexts, the good child is polite, emotionally contained, low maintenance. The aesthetics differ. The mechanism is the same. The self learns to earn love by reducing friction. The tragedy is not that the child becomes capable, it's that he learns to confuse being valued with being useful. As an adult, this often translates into an uneasy relationship with authority. Teachers, bosses, institutions, even partners. There is competence, reliability, and often success. And beneath it, a quiet anxiety about stepping out of line. Approval feels regulating. Disapproval feels destabilizing. From a Jungian perspective, the persona here is not false. It is overdeveloped. It becomes the primary interface with the world. The shadow fills with everything that might disrupt approval: anger, ambition, refusal, desire. Those qualities don't disappear. They wait, and they often return later as burnout, resentment, or a sense of being trapped inside a life that looks correct but feels strangely hollow. What began as virtue becomes a relational pattern. The man who overfunctions at work but hesitates to ask for what he wants. The man who excels academically yet doubts his inner authority. The man who waits for permission long after it is needed. This is not because he lacks strength. It is because his strength was trained to move in one direction only. Quiet competence became the safest way to belong. And while that strategy may have earned love once, it quietly asks a question in adulthood that can no longer be ignored. Who am I when no one is grading me? That question does not demand an answer yet. It simply marks the edge of a pattern that is beginning to loosen. And as we move forward, we'll look at what happens when control enters the picture, not as cruelty, but as care that never learned how to listen. That is where the story turns. There is a form of parenting that rarely gets questioned because it wears the language of responsibility, structure, rules, high standards, consistency. From the outside, it looks like care, and often it is care, delivered by parents who believed that control was the same as protection. But inside the child, a different lesson is learned. When rules arrive without dialogue, when obedience is valued more than understanding, the child's nervous system begins to associate initiative with danger. Not because the parent intended harm, but because the child learned that movement invited correction. In this environment, the safest position is stillness. This is where control quietly reshapes the psyche. The child does not become undisciplined. He becomes cautious. He learns to wait, to double-check himself, to look outward for cues before acting inwardly. Psychology often calls this learned helplessness, but that phrase misses something essential. What forms here is not passivity. It is energy conservation under surveillance. The child's system learns. If every move is monitored, it's better to move less. So curiosity narrows. Risk-taking fades. Desire becomes something to manage rather than explore. And paradoxically, the tighter the structure, the more the inner life retreats. This is the reversal most men don't expect. More rules do not produce inner authority. They produce compliance without confidence, discipline without self-trust. From a Jungian lens, this is where the ego never fully claims its steering wheel. Decisions are made correctly, but not internally owned. The man knows how to succeed, but not how to choose. Clinicians hear versions of this story often. Men who excel academically, who meet expectations, who build stable lives. And yet, when it comes to intimacy, where no syllabus exists, they feel strangely paralyzed. They describe an inability to know what they want, a hesitation that appears even when no one is watching, a sense of waiting for permission that never comes. This is not indecision, it is an echo. The internalized presence of control persists long after the external authority is gone. And you can sometimes feel it in very specific places. Moments where action stalls without obvious fear, where hesitation appears even in low-stakes situations, where desire is muted before it can fully register. That pause is not a flaw. It is memory held in the body. Withdrawal does not remain internal forever. It shapes how attraction works, how attachment forms, how power is negotiated in relationships. The psyche, having learned that initiative once carried consequences, often gravitates toward dynamics where direction comes from the outside, where another person leads, decides, or defines the emotional terrain. This is not weakness, it is familiarity. And it sets the stage for a pattern that feels like love, but carries an old geometry. In the next chapter, we'll connect this directly to adult relationships and trauma bonds, not the chaotic kind, but the quiet ones built on emotional absence that feels strangely like home. This is the midpoint where the story turns. What once looked like personality begins to reveal itself as adaptation, and adaptation, once seen clearly, always opens a choice. When a child learns that safety lives in silence, that lesson doesn't stay in childhood. It follows him into adulthood, not as memory, but as attraction. What was once an adaptation becomes a pattern, quietly organizing who feels familiar, who feels compelling, and who feels strangely distant even when they are kind. Repression does not eliminate desire, it redirects it. In Jungian terms, what is pushed into the shadow does not disappear. It looks for expression through projection. The parts of the self that learned not to ask, not to need, not to disrupt, often reappear outside the self, embodied by others. This is how the quiet son becomes the emotionally invisible man. He finds himself drawn to partners who are dominant, preoccupied, or emotionally unavailable. Not because he wants to suffer, but because these dynamics echo something deeply familiar. They recreate the emotional geometry of early life, where closeness existed without full mutuality. The shadow dynamic here is subtle. The man believes he is choosing love. His nervous system recognizes repetition. Trauma bonds are often imagined as chaotic, intense, dramatic. But many are built through absence rather than volatility, through emotional distance that feels normal, predictable, almost comforting. Neuroscience helps explain why this happens. Oxytocin, the bonding hormone, does not distinguish between what is safe and what is familiar. It responds to repetition, to known rhythms, to emotional patterns the body already understands. So the nervous system relaxes not in safety, but in recognition. The quiet man may feel strangely loyal to partners who do not fully see him. He may tolerate emotional asymmetry while telling himself he is being patient, understanding, devoted. What often hides beneath that loyalty is fear. Not fear of abandonment in the dramatic sense, but fear of loss as destabilization. Loss as rupture of the only relational language the body knows. Culturally, this pattern is rewarded. The strong, silent type is praised as masculine, controlled, reliable, emotionally undemanding. Strength in this story is measured by how little one needs. But this strength is often a socially rewarded wound. It looks like stability while quietly erasing reciprocity. Over time, something inside begins to strain. The psyche does not tolerate invisibility forever. Needs that were deferred eventually surface, not as clear requests, but as exhaustion. Irritability, numbness, or a vague sense of living at a distance from one's own life. This is the beginning of reckoning. Not a breakdown, not a failure, a signal. The system that once learned to survive through disappearance begins to ask for presence instead. And that request does not arrive gently. It arrives with urgency, because it has been waiting a long time. In the next chapter, we'll explore what happens at that moment, when what once felt like personality begins to crack, and something older, truer, and more alive presses forward. There comes a moment, sometimes quiet, sometimes abrupt, when the adaptation stops working. Not because the man has failed, but because the cost of staying the same finally outweighs the safety it once provided. This moment often arrives disguised as something else: burnout, numbness, a sudden irritability that feels out of character, or an unexpected surge of anger that seems to come from nowhere, startling precisely because it contradicts the image of being calm and composed. Underneath these experiences lives a belief that formed very early and rarely gets questioned. If I speak, I disrupt. If I need, I burden. These beliefs don't feel like thoughts. They feel like facts. They live in the body, not the mind. They shape posture, tone, timing. They determine what is shared and what remains hidden. For a long time, the persona holds everything together. In Jungian language, the persona is the adaptive mask that allows us to function in the world. It is not false, it is functional. But when it becomes too rigid, too narrow, it can no longer contain the parts of the self that were excluded in the name of safety. This is when individuation begins, not as a spiritual awakening, but as pressure. Individuation is simply the process of becoming whole, of reclaiming what was split off in order to belong. And it almost always begins when the old strategy can no longer manage the inner load. Many men describe this moment in public forums without realizing how precise their language is. They speak of feeling empty despite having a stable life, of sudden waves of rage that don't match their self-image, of exhaustion that sleep doesn't touch, of a strange grief they can't quite place. "I've lived quietly," one man writes, "and I don't know why I'm so tired." Another says, "Nothing is wrong, but nothing feels right." These are not signs of regression. They are signs of signal strength returning. What was muted begins to speak. The nervous system, having spent years conserving energy through withdrawal, starts to release stored charge. Emotion that had no place to go begins to surface, not elegantly, not on schedule. This can feel frightening, especially for men whose identity has been built around being steady, reasonable, and unaffected. The fear is not of emotion itself, but of losing control, of becoming someone unrecognizable. But what is emerging is not chaos. It is information. The anger carries boundaries that were never drawn. The numbness carries needs that were postponed. The fatigue carries the weight of self-suppression sustained for too long. This is where the central question sharpens. Is this introversion or armor? Armor has weight. It restricts movement. It was once necessary, even life-saving. But when worn too long, it begins to limit what the body can do. What once felt like personality reveals itself as adaptation. And adaptation, once seen clearly, opens a choice. Not a demand to change. Not a mandate to become louder, more expressive, or more assertive. Simply the recognition that quiet can now be inhabited differently. That silence no longer has to mean absence. In the final chapter, we'll speak about what it means to remove the armor without losing the self, to reclaim introversion as choice, not inheritance, and to separate temperament from trauma without blame. At the end of this arc, something important becomes clear. Introversion itself was never the problem. Depth is not the wound. Quiet is not the wound. Sensitivity is not the wound. What shaped so many lives was not temperament, but training. Not who you were, but what your nervous system learned it had to do in order to stay connected. When that distinction lands, something softens. Introversion can be reclaimed as choice rather than inheritance, as a way of relating to the world that includes reflection, solitude, and depth, without requiring self-erasure. Quiet becomes a place you can enter and leave, not a cage you live inside. There is grief here, and it deserves respect. Grief for the parts of you that learned to wait. Grief for the words that were swallowed. Grief for the needs that learned to arrive quietly, or not at all. But there is also dignity. You were not born withdrawn. You were trained to survive elegantly. You learned how to regulate yourself in environments that could not regulate with you. That intelligence does not disappear just because it is no longer needed. What changes is the context. A useful image here is simple. It is like wearing a heavy coat indoors for years. The coat made sense once. It kept you warm in a cold environment. Over time, though, it begins to restrict movement. You sweat without knowing why. You feel uncomfortable but can't quite name it. Removing the coat does not mean rejecting warmth. It means recognizing that the room has changed. The true turning point is not becoming louder, bolder, or more expressive for its own sake. It is separating temperament from trauma without blame. Seeing which parts of you are preference and which parts were protection. That separation restores choice. And choice is where sovereignty begins. If this mapped your experience in any way, you are not alone in it. Many men carry this pattern quietly, assuming it is simply who they are. Sometimes leaving one signal below, a phrase, a memory, a recognition, is enough to help someone else see themselves with more clarity. Not to fix, not to perform, just to recognize.